Born Araminta Ross, known later to the world as Harriet Tubman, her story begins in Dorchester County, on the marshy eastern shore of Maryland. The exact year of her birth is still a mystery. 1820, 1821, maybe even 1825. Her death certificate said 1815. Her gravestone says 1820. But no one really knows for sure. Because when a black child was born into slavery, few thought that child's life would be worth documenting. Her parents, Ben and Harriet Ross, were enslaved and illiterate. Her grandmother, Modesty, was brought over on a slave ship from Africa. Harriet once said she was called one of those Ashantis, a name that hinted at a proud African lineage, though the facts are murky, as is so much about her early life. Araminta, or Minty as she was called, was a loved child. Her mother hoped she'd learn to sew, weave, and cook, anything to avoid the brutal work in the fields. But life on the Brodess plantation offered little escape. Maryland, while just above the Mason-Dixon line, still clung fiercely to slavery. The eastern shore where she lived was a place of contrast, lush fields, winding waterways, abundant wildlife, but under that beauty was a system of violent oppression. Harriet was enslaved from birth. By age 12, she'd suffered a traumatic head injury after intervening to help another enslaved person. The blow left her with seizures, visions, and powerful spiritual dreams, experiences she later saw as divine messages guiding her purpose. It was in those early years, listening to her parents tell stories of Moses, that the seed was planted. One day, she wouldn't just seek her own freedom, she would return, again and again, to lead others out of bondage. Harriet's Christian faith had long been a source of strength. As a child, she had been influenced by Samuel Green, a free black Methodist preacher who lived nearby. Though no blood relation, Green bore the same surname as Harriet's mother, Rick Green, and likely served as a spiritual role model. In a time when black worshippers gathered in fields, cabins, or hidden forest clearings, the black church functioned as a sanctuary, both spiritual and political. This so-called invisible institution shaped Harriet's worldview, her resilience, and her divine sense of mission. By the late 1840s, Harriet had endured decades of brutal enslavement under the Brodess family, who owned both her and her mother. The Brodess household was headed by Mary Brodess, a widow who inherited enslaved people as part of her estate, including young Minty. The Brodess family treated enslaved people as little more than property. When Mary Brodess's finances grew unstable, there was always the looming threat that Harriet or her family members could be sold deeper into the South, a fate often likened to a death sentence. The fear of being torn from her family haunted Harriet. She had already witnessed two of her sisters sold off without warning, never to be seen again. When Mary Brodess died in 1849 and her son Edward began liquidating assets, Harriet knew she had to act. Years earlier, in the early 1840s, Harriet had met John Tubman, a free black man living in the area. Despite the risks, they married around 1844. It was an unusual union for the time. Harriet, still enslaved, had no legal rights, while John's status as a free man gave him limited autonomy. Though their relationship was often strained by the harsh realities of slavery, their marriage gave Harriet a sense of connection and perhaps even hope for a freer future. That hope turned to resolve. In 1849, under the cover of night and armed with little more than courage and faith, Araminta Ross made her escape. Traveling by foot, she moved northward through a secret network of abolitionists, safe houses, and sympathetic guides, what would come to be known as the Underground Railroad. Upon reaching Philadelphia, she adopted a new name, Harriet Tubman. Harriet, in honor of her mother. Tubman, after John. The change symbolized not just a new identity, but a personal rebirth, from Araminta the enslaved to Harriet the free woman. After her own escape in 1849, she made the unthinkable decision to return to slaveholding territory. Not once or twice, but at least 13 times, risking her life on every journey to lead others out of bondage. She left husband John behind, believing she would return to bring him north. But when she finally made it back to Maryland in 1851, she was to discover that he had taken another wife in her absence, a free black woman named Caroline. Over the next decade, she guided more than 70 enslaved people to freedom, including siblings, nieces, nephews, and even strangers, through the secret routes of the Underground Railroad. Her timing was perilous. The South was growing increasingly volatile. Just 2 decades earlier, in 1831, Nat Turner's revolt had shaken Virginia and the entire slaveholding class. Turner and a band of followers staged a bloody uprising that killed nearly 60 white slaveholders. His revolt wasn't just a rebellion, it was a declaration that enslaved people would not remain passive forever. Although Turner was eventually captured and executed, his ghost lingered. White fears of rebellion only intensified, and the price for helping slaves escape became higher than ever. Despite this, Harriet returned again and again. She navigated forests, rivers, and hostile towns, often traveling at night, guided by the North Star and whispers of safe houses. She carried a pistol, not to fight slave catchers, but to deter anyone in her group from turning back. Failure was not an option. "I never ran my train off the track," she would later say, "and I never lost a passenger." Because of her uncanny ability to deliver people to freedom, enslaved communities began calling her Moses. Like the biblical liberator, she seemed divinely chosen to lead her people out of captivity. Her name and her legend began to spread. So did the fear among plantation owners. Ads offering rewards for her capture appeared in Southern newspapers, describing her in detail, though they never managed to catch her. Harriet didn't work alone. She collaborated with some of the era's most influential abolitionists, including William Still, who kept meticulous records of those she helped deliver, and Frederick Douglass, who publicly praised her courage. While others spoke and wrote against slavery, Harriet acted. She became a living symbol of resistance, a force powered by faith, fury, and a vision of freedom that wouldn't let her rest. After reaching Philadelphia, Harriet Tubman found more than freedom. She found a thriving and resilient community. During the years leading up to her escape, southeastern Pennsylvania, most of Delaware, and northeastern Maryland formed the largest cluster of free black populations in the country. Philadelphia, with its 20,000 black residents by 1847, served as the first safe harbor for countless freedom seekers. The majority were not native to the city, but had fled from Maryland and Delaware, just like Harriet. Once there, she quickly found work, likely as a domestic servant or laundress, roles often available to newly arrived black women. While records of her early days in the city are scarce, we know that she supported herself through labor, as did many in the bustling, overcrowded black neighborhoods of Philadelphia. Still, freedom in the North wasn't without its dangers. The passage of the Fugitive Slave Law in 1850 changed everything. Now, even in free states, formerly enslaved people could be captured and returned. Harriet was devastated when a friend, Jerry Henry, was seized and dragged back into slavery. This new threat forced her and many others to flee even farther north to Canada. Canada, ironically, had its own history of slavery, with African slaves recorded as early as the 1620s in New France. But by the mid-1800s, it had become a haven. Settling in St. Catharines, Ontario, Harriet continued her rescue missions from across the border. There, she found a community of formerly enslaved people building new lives safe, at least for now, from U.S. slave catchers. In 1852, Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe electrified the anti-slavery movement, giving literary voice to the horrors Harriet Tubman and millions of others had lived. The novel stirred Northern sentiment, and Harriet's missions took on even greater urgency. In 1858, she met John Brown, the fiery white abolitionist preparing for an armed uprising. Harriet admired his fierce moral clarity and even helped him recruit supporters for his doomed raid on Harper's Ferry. He affectionately called her General Tubman. When the Civil War broke out, Harriet was cautious about embracing President Lincoln, fearing he would prioritize preserving the Union over ending slavery. But by January 1863, when Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, Harriet's mission and the Union's aims began to align. That same year, Tubman was recruited by Union officers like Thomas, Wentworth Higginson, and James Montgomery. She served as a nurse, scout, and spy for the Union Army, using her knowledge of Southern terrain to guide missions. On one legendary night in June 1863, she led the Combahee River Raid in South Carolina, freeing over 700 enslaved people in a single operation. It was the first time in North American history that a woman, black or white, led a military assault. Despite her wartime heroism, Harriet Tubman was never fully compensated for her service. As a spy, nurse, and scout for the Union Army, she risked her life repeatedly but received little to no formal pay. Tubman spent years petitioning the government for a military pension, navigating endless bureaucracy. She was eventually granted a widow's pension, not for her own service, but for that of her late husband, Nelson Davis, a Union soldier she had married in 1869. Her compensation amounted to just $8 a month. Still, Harriet did not let poverty quiet her spirit. After the war, she returned to her home in Auburn, New York, where she built a sanctuary not just for herself, but for those with nowhere else to go, the poor, the sick, and the forgotten. Her modest property became a hub of charity and care, later formalized as the Harriet Tubman Home for the Aged, one of the first elder care centers established by an African-American woman. She was widowed in 1888, when Nelson passed away after years of poor health. Harriet never remarried. She instead turned her energy toward the women's suffrage movement, joining the likes of Susan B. Anthony on the lecture circuit. In 1904, she was introduced as a living legend at the New York State Women's Suffrage Association convention. Audiences were captivated, not by polished speeches, but by raw truth. Harriet spoke not of theories or politics, but of survival, of bondage, of the fight for dignity. Over the decades, she adopted at least 5 children, housed dozens of elderly residents, and inspired thousands through her storytelling. Yet until her death in 1913, she lived in poverty. She passed away surrounded by loved ones, her name already etched into American memory, but still denied full honors. In total, Harriet Tubman is credited with directly guiding more than 70 people to freedom and influencing the escape of hundreds more. During the Combahee River Raid in 1863, she became the first woman in U.S. history to lead a military operation, liberating over 700 enslaved people in a single night. Today, her name adorns schools, parks, stamps, and federal buildings. She was posthumously inducted into the Military Intelligence Hall of Fame. Her face is set to appear on the $20 bill, making her the first African-American woman to hold that honor. But her true monument lies in the freedom she carved out with her own hands against impossible odds. Harriet Tubman didn't just dream of freedom, she fought for it and made it real. Thanks for watching another Fresh K documentary. If you found Harriet Tubman's story as powerful as we did, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment to let us know who we should cover next. And as always, stay tuned for more stories that move history forward.
You know I'm on that grind. Voices of the past echo through the years. Cause of the struggles and their triumphs, see the hidden tears. In every line of wisdom flows like a stream. Join me on this journey, let's feel the dream.
Telling all the stories that you never know.
Yo, drop the dealer. Legacy file, let it resonate. History encoded, elevate the stake. Black soul, never underestimate. Grinding hard, got the vision crystal clear. Channeling the past, so we persevere.